Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Whistlekick Martial Arts Radio. This is part 2 of the series on the mindset of martial artists. In part 1, we talked about the mindset of the beginner martial artist. In this episode, we're going to talk about the mindset of the intermediate martial artist, which I'm going to not define in any kind of concrete way. How are we defining an intermediate martial artist? An intermediate martial artist is someone who is no longer a beginner, but we would not call advanced. And the reason that we can't define that is that the characteristics that make someone an intermediate martial artist, sort of in-between space, is incredibly subjective. Someone could have a beginner mindset and face all the challenges that we went through in part 1 through white belt or yellow belt or even up through blue. I've known green and purple belts who act like beginners. They still have the fear and the concern and the struggles with not knowing anything. But I think for the most part, we can think of the intermediate martial artist as your typical intermediate ranks. And of course, those vary depending on what martial art we're talking about, what school. But let's say it's generally someone who's been training for at least a few months, up to a few years. So what's the mindset of the intermediate martial artist? This is a point in time where a lot of people drop out of training because they start to feel like they've got a good handle on what's going on. They oftentimes become complacent. They start to think like they know what's going on until they start working with advanced martial artists. But your intermediate martial artist is going to carry themselves in a much better way than the beginner martial artist. The beginner martial artist is unconfident, they're unsure, and pretty much everything they do is characterized by that. But the intermediate martial artist is everything they do is characterized not by a competency, but a familiarity, an awareness of what's there, what could be, and most of them are going to be aware that they're lacking in some way. Conscious incompetence, we could call it. I've heard it described that way recently. They know that there's a lot that they don't know. But they may have some sense of what they do know. Now, quite often there's a disconnect between what they think they know and what they actually know. But that's not necessarily the case. Now, why do we have to care about the mindset of the intermediate martial artist? Because we have to interact with them. You may be an intermediate martial artist. You may be advanced or beginner. You may be an instructor. So understanding what's going on in the mind of the intermediate martial artist makes us better when we try to teach them, or we spar with them, or we simply have a conversation with them about martial arts. The intermediate martial artist, possibly more than, well, no, never mind. What I was going to say, I'll finish my thought because it's frustrating to be able to finish thoughts. I was thinking I would say the intermediate martial artist craves validation more than others. But I think that that's on an individual basis, so I'm not going to commit to that. The intermediate martial artist, in my experience, craves novelty. This is one of the biggest challenges, and I think it's one of the reasons that in many schools I hear them complain that it's when someone reaches those intermediate ranks that they are most likely to leave. Because for the most part, they've learned the majority of the fundamental techniques. Maybe there are some forms that they haven't learned. But the amount of time that goes between learning something new has extended quite a bit. When you're a beginner, everything's new. Every class there's something new. you're doing something wrong, you're being corrected, and it's overwhelming, right? If you watched part one, that's the major characteristic of the beginner martial artist, is that overwhelming feeling. The intermediate martial artist finds that they miss that overwhelming feeling, that they've gone so far to the other side of that spectrum that they miss the novelty, and they're feeling bored. They feel like they know everything. Oh, I've already learned that. If you're a teacher, you've probably heard some intermediate martial artists say, but we've already learned this. They want more new stuff. And let's be fair, we've kind of conditioned them with a bunch of new stuff because we gave them new things, lots of novelty early on in their training. And then all of a sudden, we've taught them everything, and they want more. Oh, my apologies, I just realized that was hanging there. How do we work with that? There are plenty of instructors who would just say, well, they've got to get over it. They'll figure it out. I don't think that's fair. If we want to interact with the intermediate martial artists, we have to help them see where the novelty is in the things that they've already learned. How by adjusting your stances, all of your forms, your sparring, your basics are suddenly different, because now you're able to better apply force, or your reaction time's better, or you're faster. To help them get through this kind of dip in their training that honestly lasts for years, and condition them to be more accustomed to value outside of novelty, because that's going to help them get to the advanced ranks. If the mindset of the intermediate martial artist is a craving for novelty and a devaluation, maybe even an outright rejection of that which they've known and learned, if we want them to continue, we have to help them see where that new information is coming from. Helping them see the value of their own training, of helping them experiment, trying things out on their own, can be incredibly valuable. I've known intermediate martial artists who start experimenting with things and come up with really good stuff that can set the tone for the rest of their training careers. The middle of anything is usually the toughest. If you ask someone to memorize a set of terms or numbers, statistically they'll have the hardest time with those in the middle. The middle of a book is generally the least exciting. I think it's human nature that the middle of anything is the most difficult to persist through. If you think about martial arts, we take the foundation of being a beginner, and we're stacking blocks, whatever visual analogy you might want to use, but we haven't reached the advanced stage yet. You can't see the top of the mountain. You're still, I'm going to use a hiking analogy because I like hiking. If you've ever hiked a mountain and you get halfway, 3/4 of the way up, you can't see the bottom, but you can't see the top. You have this sense or lack of sense of where you are. And that's probably the best analogy I can think of for the intermediate martial artist. They don't quite know where they fit in. They've been doing it too long to be called a beginner, but they're not good yet. They're intermediate. And that can be lonely and frustrating, and it requires, just as with the beginner, but for different reasons, some compassion. So if you work with intermediate martial artists, give them some compassion. Help them understand that it gets better, and they have the opportunity to find novelty in what they're doing. They just have to look for it. If you're an intermediate martial artist, trust that if you keep going, it gets better. It gets a lot better. And it's worth the investment. I will be back with part 3 of this, the mindset of the advanced martial artist. Now, if you like this show, of course, you might be watching this on YouTube. You might be listening to it at whistlekickmartialartsradio.com, where we keep all the episodes. You might be listening to it in your podcast app. Did you know we have a Whistlekick Martial Arts Radio app available on both iOS and on Android? We do. It's free. People like it. If you want to follow us on social media, we're at Whistlekick everywhere you can imagine. And if you go to whistlekick.com and use the code podcast15, you'll save 15% off the stuff that we sell. Uniforms and a whole bunch of other good stuff. You want to email me, jeremy@whistlekick.com. Until next time, train hard, smile, and have a great day.